Hello, everybody. Welcome to our May edition of our ongoing webinar series here at Homeline. This month we'll be talking security deposits. So I'm going to give folks just a couple minutes before we get started as people are coming in. But so hang tight and we will get going in a couple minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone. If you're just joining in, this is our May rendition of our ongoing webinar series. We're going to be discussing security deposits today, and we're just going to give it another minute or so for folks to come in and join us and get settled before we start in on our presentation for the day. So, thank you. Okay, give it another minute. I'll go ahead and get started here. So welcome everyone to the May edition of our ongoing webinar series here at Homeline on tenant landlord law. This month we'll have Patty Hector here with us, who's a housing attorney here at Homeline. She'll be going over security deposits. And so just a couple of housekeeping bits before we get over to that. In case you aren't aware, if this is your first time here, Homeline is a statewide nonprofit, and we have been advising tenants across the state of Minnesota in one way, shape, or form since 1992. We recently just passed our 300,000th renter that we've assisted, so big old milestone over here. We primarily work through a hotline, so folks can call in and leave us messages, and then we'll contact you back. We do offer our services in 4 languages: Somali, English, Hmong, and Spanish. We also have an email and attorney option that you can utilize as well if that's a preferred method of communication. This is our hotline. These are all of our language lines. So again, we are open to tenants specifically across the state of Minnesota. So a couple of housekeeping things. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website in a few days after this, along with the slides, well, PDF version of the slides. If you have questions throughout, we highly encourage you to ask questions. Some folks did submit theirs beforehand as part of the registration process, but we also, if you have questions that come up during the session, please put them in the Q&A. We will get to them either at the end of the slides, or if they are pertinent to that portion, I'll try and slip them in when things are at a lull in the conversation. So again, please utilize the Q&A at the bottom. If the chat, just things get lost, I feel badly if I miss things. So please use the Q&A. I will, however, be posting links and things in the chat for you to be able to use if you need additional information. We are going to be applying for CLE credit after the session is done. Not certain if it's going to be what number of CLE credit, at least 1, maybe 1.5, depends on how this goes. So standard CLE credits for that. So then without further ado, I am going to switch over and stop sharing my screen and let Patty share hers so that we can get started.
Okay, so see if make sure we get this. Okay, make sure I got it. Give me a second.
There we go.
All right, and I want to mention, as I mentioned to Rachel just before I got started, I'm home alone. I have a dog. The mail carrier just came. She got her barks in, and she's in the house. So I hope there'll be no. That was pretty good timing.
Perfect.
So I'm going to pull this up, and so we are going to talk about security deposits for at least an hour. There we go. So starting with this image, I mean, a deposit's money that the tenant's paying and the landlord's holding it. So essentially, they're a bank. And interest is to be accrued, and we'll get into all that. I'm starting with this image, and I realize most of the participants are tenants and or service providers assisting tenants. There may be some landlords out there. And I mean no disrespect having a pig represent the bank. In fact, I am a landlord. So it is just the image that and just to get a little lightness and get this started. So first things first, and if I way I'm going to measure this screen here. Some bars. Okay, there we go. All right. So what is a security deposit? So the security deposit is laws are pretty much governed by statute number 504B.178, which we're going to discuss and do general overview. And I'm going to highlight certain areas that we get questions about. I'll also provide kind of a deeper dive. I wouldn't say line by line analysis, but kind of a highlighted form of the statute in order and with a side margin picking out some points. That might be for more landlords and practitioners, and that can be available as a PDF file, but it won't be part of the slides. So by definition, in that statute, it says, and I'm going to paraphrase it, that's a deposit of money to secure performance. It's not rent. Okay. And other things to define it way in the negative, what else a deposit is not? It is not a pre-lease or a deposit to hold. Now, there's a statute that governs that. As the name implies, that's money put down before a lease is signed. There's a separate statute that governs it. We won't be covering it here today, but that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about a security deposit. And we're also not talking about a fee. You often see leases where the parties agree that the rent is going to be X and the deposit is going to be Y. And then they might have fees. They might say, all right, you're going to have pets or you want to smoke, we're going to add a fee for that, et cetera. That's not what we're talking about either in the statute. Then we get and I put in quotes, non-refundable deposit. By definition, deposit, as you see in the example or the definition listed in the statute, and just kind of the common sense definition, a deposit is something that's being held and will be returned if there's certain criteria is met. So the non-refundable deposit, I'd argue, is ambiguous. And whenever there's ambiguous terms in a lease, the tenant gets to decide. I would argue that, it's a deposit. And if it's a deposit, it's to be returned, again, if the circumstances are met and it's interest bearing. And also, just to give some perspective, I'm not the one that holds all the cards and all the statistics, but we got a lot of statistics and we monitor the nature and in what categories, and security deposits have pretty much consistently been in the top 5 reasons why tenants call. Although now we're seeing a great influx in evictions, et cetera, but security deposits are holding pretty solid in that top range of calls. So to start, it's kind of not well understood, but security deposits, they're not required. They are often provided in a lease, and there are often 1 month's rent, but just bear in mind, they're not required. Okay. Now, sometimes we might see deposits, far less than 1 month's rent. That might be because a landlord believes they've done a really good job of screening their tenant, They recognize to get good tenants in that might be short of money, having to prepay first month's rent and come up with a deposit. They may provide a lease with a lesser deposit. We also have landlords who, because of some they're finding in either a rental or a credit history, they may insist on a larger deposit. Sometimes you see double deposit. There's no rhyme or reason. It's just whatever the parties can agree to. But typically we're looking at a 1 month's deposit, understanding that if the lease continues, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, at the end of the term, the rent probably has gone up, deposits stay the same, but interest accrues. So it's just a way of kind of a rule of thumb in practice that landlords will collect a deposit equal to 1 month's rent. Currently, only Minneapolis has some restrictions that it can only be 1 month's rent, but there are some exceptions. You can see the date that ordinance was put in place, and there's a site to it. Haven't really heard too many of these. We also know that St. Paul was floating and was going to enact something similar along with some other tenant protections. That kind of has gone away. But just to kind of keep in mind that some newer changes, like in a different webinar, we probably discussed rent caps. St. Paul right now has rent caps, no other city. But perhaps this may be a trend, it may not be, but things tend to start with those bigger cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, maybe enacting, in this case, caps on security deposits or caps on rent increases. But for most leases, again, it's not required. It's usually 1 month's rent. So, and the heart of the statute, what does the landlord have to do when the tenant's leaving? So that's usually when we're getting the calls. And so I'm quoting part of the statute here, and that is the landlord has 3 weeks. Now that's shortened to 5 days if the property is condemned, from when 3 things happen. And that is the termination of the tenancy, the tenant is vacated, and they've received the tenant's delivery instructions. And then I'll go on to say what they have to do. So I want to back up to, that the termination of the tenancy and the date the tenant has vacated, they're not always the same. A tenant may pay through the end of the month and vacate 5 days early because they have a chance to get to their new place. And let's say they've given delivery instructions. I'd argue that the 21-day clock starts at the third and last of those 3 criteria, which on my hypothetical is the last day of the month. I also have the reverse of that. The tenancy ends on the last day of the month, and then the tenant holds over for a few days. So that 21-day clock, again, starts when all 3 of those things have happened. I want to focus a little bit more on the tenant's delivery instructions. Now, most often, tenants are expecting, payment to be returned to them. So they're going to provide a physical address. And but in this day and age, things are changing. We're seeing a lot of rents being paid electronically and maybe deposits being received that way. And the tenant's delivery instructions may be to electronically return my deposit in the state. So like back up for a second. If it's mail, they're in compliance. If it's postmarked the 21st day, if that 21st day falls on a Sunday, they get 1 more day. So if a tenant's calling us and we're right around that mark, and if their instructions were to mail, I kind of say, let's wait until about 3, 4, 5 days post the 21st day, just to see if something got postmarked. Postmarked is key. I mean, anybody could write a letter and date it the 21st day of the month, but throw it in the mail a few days later. So it's not the date of the letter, it's the date it's postmarked, not received by the. For these other delivery instructions, electronic payment, or maybe tenants doesn't, just says, hey, call me when it's ready. That's that 21st day. Now, if the landlord, let's stick on the mailing instruction. Let's say the landlord is going to retain the entire deposit, and they think, well, I'm not sending a check, so there's no reason for me to go out and get a letter and get a stamp and put it in a mailbox. I could just email the tenant saying you're not getting your deposit back. So I would argue that that's actually a technical violation. I mean, the instructions were to mail it. And so the letter should say, we're not returning your deposit, and here's why. We'll get into that in detail, but I'm just pointing out that the delivery instructions are pretty key. We had a former colleague, Paul, who used to say, if the tenant says, hey, landlord, send my deposit to the moon, send it to the moon. So that's one thing, is to, there can be technical violations of what the tenant's delivery instructions were. And so just keep that in mind. It goes to timing and also method of communication. Now, what do they have to do after the 3 weeks, or again, 5 days after condemnation? They have to either return that full deposit plus 1% interest. Incidentally, that 1% has been the current rate of interest since August of 2003, so going on 20 years. We do occasionally get callers that have leases that have extended prior to that. There is an interest calculating form. We have form letters for both demanding a security deposit return, which I'll highlight later, and also the calculations. So you can see prior to August 2003, it had varied 3 and even years before that up to 5%. But the current rate at 1%, certainly very easy to calculate in your head. But they have to calculate the deposit plus interest and return that, or they have to provide a letter explaining any and all deductions, and it has to provide the specific reasons for the deductions. Okay, that's a pretty key term. See, I jumped ahead here. I said, even again, if no money is to be returned, that communication still has to be sent as requested. So specific reason for deductions, sometimes it can be a technical argument there, and that is some lump sum, cleaning, $180. Well, I don't know what does that mean? Is that, $18 an hour times, whatever that calculate out, difficult math here, but I think they have to say it. And a lot of tenants are surprised to learn that the landlord doesn't have to provide receipts. I think a landlord should. I think it just kind of lays all the cards on the table, and that is, you did X damage, and here is my cost to repair it. I've either already incurred the costs or I anticipate I will. But they have to spell that out. And if they get something in the tenant's hands, it's properly postmarked, timed, and it cites the reasons for deductions. That doesn't mean the tenant has. That's kind of the first analysis, and that is, did the landlord, at least technically, meet the terms of the statute, and that is timely respond to the tenant explaining any withholdings. So the big crux of the statute, and the reason people call, is because they're worried about deductions that have been taken. And so the statute defines what the landlord can and can't deduct for. And you can see on the slide, they can only deduct for physical damages, and I put in quotes, ordinary wear and tear. Clearly, that is subjective language, but it would not include pre-existing damage. And I kind of jumped ahead here. Also, what question comes up a lot, and that is, does the landlord have to paint or change carpeting between tenants? The answer is no, they don't. But they can only charge, as I said, for damages beyond ordinary care. Flooring and walls are pretty common reasons for deductions. And so you could expect, just kind of natural, like sun, shadows on the wall, things like that, little bumps, things there in the wall would be pretty typical. I think the extreme example might be, pick on families with children, they go wild with a Sharpie marker. See things, the walls, something like that might be a reason for the landlord to charge for painting in between. Carpet and flooring, but mostly carpet, because it doesn't live forever, like, let's say, wood floors will. If the landlord is trying to have the replacement cost of the carpet borne by the tenant, they should be at least acknowledging some depreciated value of the carpet. A question we get oftentimes is, what's the lifespan of a carpet? And the answer is, there really isn't anything per se, but I put a site here. It's just a very, very general site, IRS publication for a landlord when they're making depreciation deductions for, their assets, and carpeting would be assets. And there's a chart there you can look at, but for the most part, it's kind of an either or. We get tenants who contact us and the landlord has asked for 100% replacement of the carpet. And the longer in time that tenant has lived there, and the landlord hasn't even addressed depreciation at all, I think right then and there's got to be something, even if it's the only lived there 1 year, and the landlord, let's say they destroy the carpet, they only have to pay, they don't have to pay that 1 year of that lifespan of the carpet, but the remaining. Kind of a rule of thumb, and I hate to always give a rule of thumb, but 7 years, somewhere in that area. But less about what the number is, just that the calls to us, they're usually black or white. The landlord has deducted from the deposit full replacement costs and not even considered depreciation. So that's where a lot of the physical damages deductions come from. The deposit also can be used to offset debt still owed by the tenant per the contract. So if any rent hasn't been paid, by God, they get to apply that, as well as late fees, even old ones. Sometimes a tenant moves out and the landlord gives them a bill and says, hey, 6 months ago, you missed a late fee. And so they get to tack it on. And another cost that can lease agreement is that if there's court case brought against the tenant and the landlord has hired an attorney and they've had attorney's fees. Now, I'm going to focus for now on eviction cases. Let's say the tenant, for whatever reason, although typically got behind on rent, and they either do or don't redeem the tenancy. Of course, the landlord's going to apply that deposit towards, probably in this case, unpaid rent, which probably won't cover it. And they've got court fees. But for purposes of redemption, it gets $5 towards attorney's fees for the eviction. Now, let's say the tenant redeems, they stay. Then the landlord turns around and says, well, here's my attorney's bill for having this case. So the contract, if it provides that if the landlord has to take the tenant to court and they incur attorney's fees, the tenant has to pay. That's separate from the eviction. It's not part of redemption. But incidentally, and that's not really part of this discussion, but whenever you see attorney's fees awarded, it's bilateral. So I guess if a tenant had to file a lawsuit against the landlord and they hired an attorney, they could make the landlord pay their attorney's fees as well. But again, for purposes of this discussion, for deductions from the deposit, it's those physical damages beyond ordinary wear and tear and debts still owed. And this is unwaivable. You don't, if you see a lease that says, if you vacate early, you forfeit your deposit. That can't be. Even if it's an assigned agreement, it's unenforceable. And there's this case site for that. So avoiding deduction. No,
Actually, Patty, can I interrupt for just a second here? I wanted to point out, I put this in the chat as well, but the Minnesota Attorney General and Housing Hub, a landlord that works throughout a lot of Minnesota, just actually came to a settlement agreement not long ago regarding some of these fees that Housing Hub was charging that the AG says were in violation of the security deposit statutes. So I put a link in our chat to that communication from the AG. Now, this isn't a court case, of course, so it's not necessarily precedential, but it is telling as to how at least the Attorney General interprets that particular statute and how it relates to carpet cleaning and replacing light bulbs and some of those other things that are not ordinary wear and tear.
Yeah, I went back to the last slide, and remember in the beginning, we talked about fees and stuff. I kind of want to tie these together. Let's say your lease says from the start, rent is X, deposit is X, and when you move out, there's going to be an automatic carpet cleaning fee. Okay, so I think this is where you were going. And so again, the statute says they can only deduct for damages beyond ordinary wear and tear. So if the carpet was clean when the tenant moved in and not clean when they moved out, I think within our office, we may have some arguments about whether cleaning expenses are automatic, or whether cleaning itself can be charged, but an automatic fee, if it can't be supported. Look, you could have a household that walks around on stocking feet and the carpet's great after a couple of years, or says tenant, you have to have it professionally clean. I think if it's clean, doesn't matter. Do they rent something from a hardware store or clean it themselves? But those automatic fees, there's nothing magical about them. It still comes back to, can the landlord support that deduction by saying this was a necessary cost to restore the condition to the way it was pre-tenancy? So we do see that a lot. And I think that's where you were. And I don't know if there's any more questions about those auto fees. You jumped in.
Yeah, mostly I wanted to touch base with this since it's a relatively new thing that has come from the Attorney General and touches on this, because that's been an ongoing question for years. I also put in a link to former Homeline attorney Paul Bernberg's blog on security deposits in case any of you want some very detailed, in-depth analysis of additional to what Patty is giving us. Paul likes a good analysis blog.
Excellent. Yep. Paul's got great stuff out there. Absolutely.
Yes. I think something that might be at least a little bit relevant here and is one of our tenants is asking how they get their security deposit back when their lease is verbal. And if you want to put that off until later on in the presentation, yeah, that makes sense too.
Yeah, and you know what? Yes, because in a slide or two, I probably the
Okay.
next one, I think I'm gonna hit it about what the beginning of the tenancy. So I went back to the slides. Let me click ahead, see if we're going the right direction. All right,
Mhm.
avoiding deductions. So let's see. Let's get this guy to come in. There we go. All right. 3 words: document, document, document. Now we're often getting these calls at the end of the tenancy and they've already left. They're waiting for the deposit back, or maybe just prior to leaving, what can they do to protect themselves from not having the deposit taken? So when at the beginning and ending of the tenancy, I realize we're not necessarily reaching people or talking to people when they're signing the lease, but sometimes when we're counseling them about the tenancy that has ended and they're about to plunk down a deposit elsewhere, so we can kind of give them some advice going forward. But you want it at the beginning in the tenancy document. Take pictures, take videos. Now, to the question that we just had a moment ago, and with oral and written leases, this isn't often done. Copy or receipt of the amount of the date of deposit. Now, oftentimes, let's say you start a lease and you may have written a check to the landlord for first month's rent for a security deposit. They may be equal, they may not be, maybe application fees, and it may be one lump sum of a payment. I think a better way would be maybe to make a separate payment just for the deposit. If it's a physical check, write on the memo it's deposit. If it's electronic, there's a way that you can note that it is a deposit. Oftentimes, you'll see a lease that X dollars as was collected as a deposit. The problem, though, is if a tenant, let's say the tenancy gets renewed year after year after year, some landlords will give a whole new lease, and they might say security deposit carried forward from prior lease. And then years down the road, tenant moves out and nobody knows what the deposit was, and they've probably long discarded that first lease that might have been one way of documenting what was paid. Tenants, do it yourself. That's my recommendation. Keep a copy, etc. The amount data. Other things that we see again in the beginning of the tenancy is what happens when the tenant takes possession and the unit's not clean. Or food left in the refrigerator. It's evidence that the tenants who left didn't quite get it all done. And you can understand with a landlord, trying to minimize the gap in tenancy and kind of think of like hotels. You got to check out at 11, but you can't. They've got this small window of time to do these terms in a hotel. In the landlord tenant world, oftentimes leases end on the last day of the month. It might even have a time, usually 11, 12 o'clock. And the new tenants coming in the next day, 8, 9 in the morning. So the landlord is hoping and anticipating that the outgoing tenant will take care of things. So if a tenant calls us, I've just moved in, the place is a mess. What do I do? Well, document it. And I think the first thing you want to do is let the landlord know it's not necessarily the landlord's fault, but just say, look, there's like 10 hours of cleaning here. I would like you to have it cleaned, or I will clean it and take it off my rent. And then the landlord can go back to the old tenant and get that money. But, or I say to a tenant, it sounds kind of weird. And of course, we're not visual when we're on the phone with them, so they don't see my air quotes. But if you acquire an apartment and let's say it's dirty and stuff like that, it's full of refrigerator's full of food, you're going to clean it up to your standards. And you're going to for a year or so. But when you leave, if it was documented that when you acquired the place, the refrigerator was full of food, there was crumbs all here, you get to leave it in that same condition. But most people don't live like that. But I mean, that's kind of the thing, a pre-existing condition you shouldn't be responsible for, but moving in, depending, and I'm not saying a fact pattern that's just unlivable, just, some cleaning that's going to take a little elbow grease. Shouldn't have been the tenant's, incoming tenant's responsibility. Hopefully the landlord and the tenant that up, but document it. And let's say the landlord doesn't budge, and they won't, reduce your rent. I guess a tenant could bring an action against them for whatever number of hours of labor. Maybe tenants choose not to, or wait till the tenancy's over. And if there's any deductions from the deposit and they have to file a lawsuit, they would include that. But so that's moving on. Again, the move in and move out forms. And again, we're talking about beginning and ending a tenancy. And I recognize we're not often talking to tenants at the beginning of the day, but get a copy of the form. I see a lot of tenants that they were given a form and they didn't get a copy. Now, there's a statute that requires a tenant to be giving a lease. Since move in and move out forms and even walkthroughs, we'll address in a moment, are not required, these forms aren't required. But if the landlord's giving you something to sign, get a copy of it. And don't hesitate to add things to it. Now, a real specific thing, let's just say you acquired a place, it's carpeted, and there's a little, and it's 2 inches, 3.5 feet from the northwest corner living room wall. That's really, really specific. But that's the kind of things you want to put on there. So a year or two later, when you move out, and the landlord's like, oh, well, there's a stain. And you could show that it was pre-existing and it was documented on the move-in form. So that's what tenants should do is feel free to add, a lot of these move-in forms, the landlords maybe's got a good, excellent, good, fair, and they just check it off. Everything's always good. Everything's excellent. So that doesn't, but again, focus on flooring and walls. And as I mentioned here about, go back. Uh-oh. Okay, I got to figure out how to go back. Here we go. 1 second. There we go. All right. So walkthroughs aren't required. Now I'm going to focus mostly on the ending of the tenancy. I recommend it, but sometimes the plants can get together. Sometimes they can't stand each other. And so you want to go through anyway. And if there was a move-in form presented when the tenant moved in, they should bring it out and then go over that with the landlord as they're leaving. Again, if that can't take place, then they can, like on my hypothetical, note that, here's the stain, and it's the same stain that I documented and wrote when we moved in. It's still here now, things like that. I also, hear a lot from tenants where they'll, let's say during the walkthrough, the landlord even says, wow, this looks great. This place looks great. It's never looked any better. And then within 3 weeks, behind a poison pen, the landlord reduces the deposit or something like that. So it's not what's said at that walkthrough. Indeed, they're not required. It's what the landlord does, has to be in writing. And so let's see. And so the delivery, now giving those delivery instructions, if you're in person at a walkthrough and there's a move out form, sometimes there might be a place for, hey, where's your forwarding address? And again, the forwarding address doesn't necessarily, the tenant can decide how they want to be communicated. Maybe they want it not mailed to them. Maybe they want it, Venmo or Zelle. So they should put the delivery instructions on there. And if it's a forwarding address, which also might be used for the following year's CRP, on there. If the parties don't meet, and maybe the tenant's turning in the keys, that might be a good time to place a note with the keys. Hey, here's my delivery instructions. Here's the forwarding information. Some paper trail, email, text. It doesn't hurt to give them multiple reasons. Just understand that if a tenant doesn't give any delivery instructions, all right, and maybe they're thinking, well, the landlord can just mail it to my old address, the apartment address that I've been renting at, and I have a forwarding mail on file. That might be, but if the landlord isn't told to mail it anywhere, they don't have to do anything. And notwithstanding that the tenant may have that forwarding address and file. So be explicit and tell them, maybe you say, I'm not sure where I'm going to be moving, send it to general mail or send it to my old address. But the landlord has to follow the delivery instructions that the tenant has provided. Back looking at the side of my screen, that the cleaning. I like this image. I've seen this character a lot. I think within our office, we have some debate over whether cleaning charges can be passed on to the tenant. My position is, if it just takes a little elbow grease, a little vacuuming up to avoid a dispute with your landlord, I'd say do it. But my colleagues might say, it's just tear, it's kind of clean. That doesn't require a deep clean. So, but those are some of the often reasons for deductions that we see. And recovering your deposit. So the first piece of advice is, try not to have to sue. Homeline has a free form letter that you see the link there. It's designed most for tenants who have communicated with their landlord on how to return the deposit, haven't heard anything, and it's after the 21st or plus day. So it's kind of a wake-up call, instead of, running to court, say, hey, landlord, you missed the deadline, and I could sue you for all of these things, which I'm going to get to in a moment, but I'd settle if you just give me back my deposit plus interest in 5 days. Sometimes the landlords just get caught unaware. That's a great thing. If you can avoid a lawsuit for a free form letter to fill out, put a stamp, and maybe the landlord's wallet opens up and the case is resolved, great. Another reason why you don't want to have to go to court is, well, there's a filing fee that runs about $70 to $80. In a later slide, I mentioned that that's recoverable. There's a delay before the hearing. Certainly courts were closed down for a good part of time during the pandemic. I'm thinking in Hennepin County, from the date of filing a case to the date it's being heard is probably 3 to 4 months. Someone else may know about that, but it's not, it's a relatively quick process, but it still takes months. And if you, and the other thing I asked the tenants to consider is, landlord has withheld the entire deposit. They gave their reasons. The tenant may disagree with them. And the landlord says, not only am I keeping your deposit plus interest, you owe X more. Well, sometimes a landlord might say, if you agree, we can just call it even, but if you sue me to recover the deposit, I'm going to sue you for this overage. And just understand the deposit doesn't cap the amount of damage that a landlord can assess to a tenant. So if you did file a lawsuit, especially if, well, if a tenant calls me and they said the landlord has taken most of the deposit, let's say they gave $1 back, I think there's little risk of a counterclaim because they gave something back. But for those, the red flag is if it's been clear that the landlord is not merely content with keeping the deposit plus interest, but they're indicating that the tenant's on the hook for more. Maybe you just let sleeping dogs lie. But if the tenant does file the claim, and they have a right to, there is that risk of a counterclaim. I also tell tenants that the cases are heard together. He pays their own filing fees. There's no really advantage or disadvantage who files first, but just be aware that filing a case doesn't mean that the landlord doesn't lack defenses and indeed might actually file their own counterclaim. And finally, everything goes well. Let's say you get that judgment. It includes your court fees. There's some timing and money that is involved if the landlord doesn't automatically pay. That doesn't guarantee they're going to pay. It's just a piece of paper that says the landlord owes you money. So there's a process in collections that you pay fees to get it docketed in the district court. The landlord has like 20 days to appeal it. And then the process of docketing and all the fees that are added, and then trying to find sources to levy or on wages or bank accounts, more time and more money. But at least docketing the judgment into district court means it's of public record and it stays there for 10 years. I guess if a landlord isn't paying and a tenant can't find a way to make them pay, sometimes down the road, the fact that there's a judgment out there may be a reason for a judgment debtor to pay off a debt. But that's my opinion about trying not to sue. But sometimes you just got to sue. And so when we talk about the penalty, and this is a deep dive in the statute, this is specific in the statute, and that this is for a landlord who has failed to respond at all. Okay, so we've put some nice round numbers here to do the. So let's say the deposit was $1,000. Tenant lived there for 1 year exactly at the 1% interest, very easy interest to calculate as $10. If the landlord did not comply with the statute, the tenant has a right to sue them for double the amount of the deposit plus interest. So you can see on this calculation, on this hypothetical, that would be $2,020. There's also an added clause about punitive damages. I believe it's discretionary. And I think if a tenant for this and makes a demand for the $500, if they look at the wording of the statute, which I have to the side here, I think if the landlord then doesn't at least pay the deposit, there's an inference that it's punitive, and the court may be more inclined to add that $500. We usually say just include it. And where would you take a case like this? Yeah, let's get this guy. You have to file a lawsuit in conciliation, also known as small claims court. In Minnesota, it's for cases that have dollar amounts sought up to $15,000. Parties don't need an attorney. The filing fee is generally about $70 to $80. It's recoverable if the tenant wins. The tenant should start the action in the county, either where the property is located or the landlord resides. They can choose. And I think in this, for the most part, we're still seeing most of these remote, which is kind of interesting because we often have, tenants might vacate. And before the pandemic and all cases were in person, I would also tell a tenant, give a forwarding address of something local because the landlord might think, if I keep your deposit and I know you're leaving town, you're not going to sue me. But now these cases can be brought and maintained remotely. So if a tenant leaves the state of Minnesota, they can still, for the most part, and you have to look by county, as things and have the case conducted outside of court. So that took away that, in my experience, possible landlords get that bright idea saying, what, I'm just going to take the deposit because who's going to come back and maintain an action for $1,000. So that takes that off the table. And I don't want to do too deep a dive on the how-tos for conciliation court, but at a minimum in the complaint, which you can get from, and I'll have some links in a moment, you want to include the list the amount of the deposit, the length of the tenancy, and calculate interest, and also list, let's say there's a partial refund, so I was expecting X dollars back, the landlord gave me all but Y. You can indicate that on there. Which brings up another case, a matter that what do we do if a landlord gave a partial deposit back and the tenant's not satisfied with it? So first of all, let's say they gave half back, if that returned to the tenant via mail check or some electronic payment with a notation that says, this is a settlement of your claim, and if you accept this, you waive your right to proceed for the difference. In that case, if the tenant's not satisfied with it, then I say hold on to the check, don't cash it at all. Most times the landlords don't do that. They just simply provide some money. And then the question becomes, well, is that act of a landlord owing the tenant some money and we're providing less, is that a settlement offer, and is it deemed an acceptance when that tenant takes that money, deposits it? I think within our office, again, that's one of those areas of somewhat dispute. I think it depends on how big the check is. If it's a small amount and the tenant's chasing a larger amount, I'd say, just hang on to the check. If it's a pretty large amount, the tenant needs that money. And as I've told you, that the hearing might take months to be concluded. Accept that check, just know that there's a possibility a court may deem that acceptance of the check waives their right to proceed. At the end of the slide, there's a lot of really good links, and in the next slide I'm going to show you, but there's a nice little video here, a YouTube video about tips for proceeding. So I just put that out there for just how to proceed, whether it's this case or any other conciliation court. And here's some. So these are links that I send to my clients. They're probably redundant. One is the AG's website. One is a website called Law Help, which is very user friendly, and the Minnesota court website, and gives you those forms. Statute of limitations, it is 6 years, but it's reduced if the tenant is seeking bad faith to 2 years. I would always recommend the tenant take care of things within a few months or so, not too long, but occasionally life happens and tenants call us and, can I still go with my landlord? Well, there are the numbers there for you. And I do get to say this too. At my current job and a former job, I did some litigation help and support, not actual litigation. I was in a consulting job before. I get the question when I go through the analysis with the tenant, they say, hey, Patty, what do you think? Can we sue them? And then I get to say with a smile that Sue is my middle name. So I'm drawing to an end, and I know that there'll be room for questions, but some miscellaneous. Here we go. All right. The holes in the walls. I listed that first because I had a picture to go with it, but you can see the cartoon there. No, there's definitely not a dartboard on that wall. Incidentally, that arrow and that circle down there, that hole, that dart hole was, my eyes were drawn to it. So I thought, why not bring everybody else's too? It's like ruining a movie when you see cut in the screen, and now I pointed out to you so everybody can see that one errant hole. But I will say this also, that the house that my husband and I purchased years ago, we have a wall just like this in our basement. But we do get questions about, that's excessive holes in the wall. So you might see some leases that will say, they expect tenants are going to put things up on the wall, maybe pictures. I think now with these slim TVs and mounting, that's a little bit different. There's a lot more involved in the nature of the holes, but some leases will spell out the number of holes, square foot of wall. I don't think most do. And so we get back to when the tenant leaves, what's excessive? Well, what's ordinary wear and tear? And these are tough answers to provide because it's subjective. Um, I keep thinking of a tenant that had a case about this, and they reported back to me that the landlord counted a lot. It counted all the holes in the wall. And I have a thing with one that sometimes something will spur a memory. In his case, Matt's case, it's plays and shows. In mine, it's music. And all of a sudden, every time that tenant said this, that the landlord had to count them all, I've got the Beatles song in my head, how many holes there are on the wall. Now they had to count them all. But that's one case that, and in this dartboard, yes, clearly, I mean, that's not ordinary wear and tear. I guess if they were a really good master darts person and there were no holes beyond the target, it could be an issue. So a couple other issues we encounter is pre-move out. Parties have agreed when that's going to be. Maybe there's a walkthrough scheduled. Maybe the tenant's already given the landlord forwarding instructions. And then they hand them this long list of what needs to be cleaned. And it's usually pretty extensive. And oftentimes it has things that, are pretty hard to do. Cleaning behind appliances or cleaning fixtures that are not easily accessible, ceiling fans, things like that, or outside the windows. So I think the first analysis is, well, what evidence is there that these things were clean when they moved in? One thing, aren't going to know. I doubt that somebody's going to be moving an appliance, a stove or a refrigerator, things like that. But I think you clean what you can, and you leave clean try to leave the conditions as much as they were. I think the more egregious the landlord's list is, or lengthy, and that a court will probably more like tenant that's just not reasonable to ask of them. And one also mentioned another statute that directly impacts the security deposit is if a tenant has to break lease due to being a victim of domestic violence. Now, there's a statute site there. And what happens is, I'm not going to do a deep dive on what's required to break the lease, but the impact with the tenant declaring this on the security deposit is that they provide this or they leave, and their security deposit is forfeited, and they owe no further rent. The thing is, this statute's not that old. I'm not sure. I don't know if Rachel's there, 5, 6, 7 years, but it used to be that when a tenant wanted to break the lease for domestic, they had to pay rent in the last month they're there, pay an additional month's rent, and then leave, and then wait to get their deposit back. Now, I'm guessing they'll realize that, they're already in a tough spot. Why ask them to fork up more money? We'll just have their deposit forfeited. Well, here's the thing. Back to that first screen, what if the tenant's security deposit equals 1 month rent? Then under the old statute and the new, it's pretty much the same thing. Instead of paying a future month's rent, they're forfeiting their deposit. On my hypothetical, they're the same. But some of the tenants that we speak to, for one reason or another, credit, rental history, et cetera, the landlord collected a really large deposit. So I think in those instances, this is really harsh for the tenant. But that deposit is forfeited to the landlord, kind of in exchange for not being able to collect future rent. That doesn't mean, though, that if there's damages that the tenant left behind, that the landlord can't go after the tenant. The security deposit is just breaking the lease essentially and getting off the hook for future rent. And weird. And lastly is if a tenant's contacting us, and sometimes we see this where, let's say they rented a house, and maybe I ask, or maybe they mention, I did all the snow removal and lawn care, and I might say, did you get compensated for that? And oftentimes they don't, and they weren't expecting to hear that. And I say, well, you should have been. And you could bring a case against your landlord for that uncompensated labor. I guess figure out how many snowfalls in or how often you cut the grass. But I often say, if you want to kind of avoid the whole, suing for your deposit, maybe you tell the landlord, look, I don't think you have a right to withhold this for these reasons. I don't want to have to take you to court, but if I can't get you to pay me the remainder of my deposit, I might sue for that, and I'm going to include a claim for this uncompensated labor. So that's a leverage that I think is worth throwing out there. Um, also, say a tenant has the tenancies ended, and there's a period of time where they didn't get something. There was a period of time where there was no hot water or some heat issues or something that's in the past, and it happened. They could bring a claim for partial rent refund or rent abatement. And again, though, if they're hung up on a security deposit case, and it's whether you're going to go to court or not, sometimes it's best just to maybe give up that claim just to get the deposit back and then move on. So opinions on that. And I think I've pretty much reached the end of my slides. So if Rachel wants to come back and we can maybe address some questions, I think it's a good time for that.
All right, perfect. Let me get mine. All right, so we have several questions. Again, please use the Q&A function. If you've got questions, I will run through first off some of the ones that we got through at the beginning. It's one of the perks of pre-submitting your questions is that we go through them first. All right, so the questions for you asked about what can and cannot be done from a security deposit. Hopefully we covered that. Lisa asked us to break it down in very plain language. Again, hopefully that happened for you, Lisa. Amber wants to know, was the one who wanted to know about security deposits getting when you have a verbal lease. If you have additional questions for that, please drop them in the Q&A. Anna, what happens if my landlord doesn't charge a security deposit and then tries to charge extra when we move out? So if you want to just cover that real quick.
Yeah, well, like I said before, when they do charge a deposit, that doesn't cap the amount of damages they. So if there wasn't a deposit at all, it's just the deposit invokes the amount of money that the tenant has paid the landlord's holding. So on what she's discussing, if there never was a deposit, but the tenant leaves and the tenant caused damage, the landlord can sue them. We're just not dealing with a deposit that's been held. Just like the deposit is held, it's not capped, so the landlord can keep it all and ask for more.
Gotcha. Regina is a tenant, I believe, and they're wondering if their landlord essentially edits their ledger or starts charging them for something, changes their things, the ledger after they've moved out, for what looks like pretextually that to be able to keep the security deposit for money is owed. That's a fairly specific example, but ultimately at the end of the day, if the landlord is keeping your security deposit for reasons that you disagree with, then it's the same remedy as Patty was discussing.
Yes.
Tora, I think you pre-submitted a question, but I honestly am not certain that I can make heads or tails of it. I think there was some copy paste issues with it, so I don't know that it's in the appropriate order, but I think it's something from about rental to purchase and something about 4 months. So I apologize for it. I am not certain what the question really is that you're asking. So either if you can put it in our Q&A here again, or just give us a call if it's something really specific. Kind of deal with generalities here on these webinars, but so if you've got a specific question about your specific situation, please give us a call if you're a tenant here in Minnesota. Moving along. Lola, I think, Patty covered that, and she wanted to know about mandatory things that need to happen between tenants. There are none. How do I get my Mardis want to know about security back when it's past the 21 days. You did an excellent job covering that. Heidi is a service provider and wants to know if there's a standard amount that can be kept for cleaning. And
Yeah, I mean, again, it's deceptively simple what the landlord can withhold for, and that is damages exceed normal wear and tear. So by that standard, it takes, you know, $300 to clean, it takes $300 to clean. Again, back to that dispute whether cleaning is even something, beyond normal wear and tear. But whenever we see cleaning fees, well, let's assume not a disclosed cleaning fee from the beginning, but upon the landlord asks for X dollars, I'd say, like I said, let's just call $400. They say $400 and says cleaning. Well, I think they need to be specific. How many hours and at what rate? Is it 4 hours at $100 an hour? I'll take that job. Is it 20 hours at $20 an hour? Then maybe that's reasonable. Again, assuming that parties agree that cleaning should have been done, the place was clean, and the tenant can. But short answer to the question is there's no cap. It just doesn't. It's what is required to bring the tenancy to the pre-tenancy condition, accepting ordinary right there.
all right, Chris is an attorney, I believe, and they're wondering, or they say, getting a deposit back is often more trouble than it's worth. Is there a way to hit the landlord with bad faith penalties? And I think you covered those briefly, but if you could go over again what bad faith means.
Well, as part of the lawsuit, seeking what was wrongfully withheld, including that punitive damage, I don't know, the more trouble it's worth, it's all the same lawsuit, doesn't get broken down. I mean, you'd be suing for both. I'm not sure of Chris's experience, I'm not sure male or female, but the same lawsuit that you'd file this day and age is kind of easy and in many cases remote. So I'm not sure what the time and effort concern is. But I think any time a landlord is sued and it's a public record, even though it's conciliation court, so it's not precedent setting, it's out there. And, sometimes when I'm counseling a tenant and a landlord, I might look up to see a landlord. Do they have a history of lawsuits against tenants? Do I see conciliation court cases? So good information, I think, for a tenant, maybe even before they sign a lease. And that is, yeah, I'm going to do a search. So how does that impact the landlord? I guess, this is as close to a publication as we can, and that is filing lawsuits against landlords, not just for the statutory penalties, but adding in that punitive as part of the same lawsuit.
All right. Dawn wants to know, they're a service provider. Can a landlord ask for first month's rent, last month's rent, and a deposit at move-in?
Yes. So let's break that down. Remember, I said in the beginning that I've been a landlord. And so if a landlord's concerned about a tenant and about their credit worthiness, they might say, I will ask you to pay first and last month's rent. Now, if they do that, because it's not a deposit, there's no interest accrued on that amount. And when is that last month of the tenancy going to be? Well, maybe it's an initial term of 1 year and tenant leaves it that year, fine. What happens if they stay several years? There should be a clause in there because the rent probably goes up. Does that we paid first month's rent cover it, or is the tenant on the hook for the difference? But it's one of these things, if it's not prohibited, it's okay. And the market will decide if a tenant's applying numerous places and landlords are saying really strict requirements, large deposits, double deposits, prepay last month's rent, they might just shop around and find a landlord that won't require that. But they can and they do ask for more than just a simple first month's rent and a small deposit.
So Sam is a landlord, I believe. We're going to move on to the next question. They're wanting to know, can you be evicted for not paying a security deposit right away?
Okay, they're just cut off for a second. Can you what?
Sorry. Sam wants to know, can you, assume a tenant, be evicted for not paying a security deposit right away?
Well, I mean, if it's required on the lease, it could be like any other breach. If the lease says you can't have a pet or you can't smoke, and the tenant does these things, the landlord could bring an eviction saying you've breached the lease. if the lease requires, let's say the tenant, it sounds like on this hypothetical that the tenant is only, forking over the first month's rent, and maybe they're struggling to come up with a deposit. If it's required in the lease, it's just like any other breach, and the landlord could bring that eviction
Yeah.
before that.
I know, I think part of that same Minneapolis ordinance that you were talking about earlier, Patty, to add to that, Minneapolis does have if you are charging more than 1 month's rent for security deposit, I believe you are allowed to make installments on that security deposit, I think over the first 3 months of the tenancy to be able to pay for that. So um, again, Minneapolis is the only city in the state that has any kind of specific laws specifically on secure deposits, at least right now. But as Patty mentioned earlier, those things do, once it happens somewhere, often those things will spread. So make sure you know your local laws and ordinances.
Yeah, and maybe a tenant and a landlord can negotiate, say, you know what, I'm
Mhm.
really strapped. I've got your first month's rent. And I agree to this deposit, but can I pay it in installments? Have that in writing,
Sure.
promise tenants.
All right. Last of the pre-submitted questions. Ally, I'm not certain how to pronounce it, sorry. Surfrider is wondering, just not a security deposit question, but more of a general question for Homeline with this increase in volume, how has that affected our organization and how are we adapting? Um, so yes, there's been a huge increase in volume, frankly, since 2020. 2021 and 2022, and now into 2023, we've had just every month over month, we've had record numbers of calls and things like that. And so, our mostly what that is affecting is how fast we are able to turn around and respond back to tenants who call us. So that, many, many moons ago, most of our calls were returned same day. Now we're looking at like a week out sometimes, which isn't, you know, but we're trying to give the same level of service that we always have. Um, but it's just sheer cubic capacity, as it were, for how much we can do. So that's what we're doing. We should be getting some summer interns here shortly. I'm very excited about that. But yeah, we're doing the best we can with what we've got. So being a nonprofit as well, that sometimes limits our ability to hire to fill the need as easily as other places might be able to. Okay,
I
so
was,
that was, mhm,
I was gonna say, even though our turnaround time frame is longer than we like, we do get back to people.
yeah, I know
And
that.
also, you
Mhm,
know, sometimes it makes sense to email their question to us instead of calling in the hotline.
yep,
Because that avoids the call back and leaving a message and back. If the tenants can submit their questions orally to our hotline number, and I know that information was up, it will be on again, but also they can email their question, and that's a really good idea. If there's documents involved that we're going to need to see, and they can email middle of the night. Technically, we can respond in the middle of the night, although I might, if I'm working odd hours, I might. I know. Hang on. My go-to is I select a send time, and so I have a certain time involved. So I know that I might have created it at some time, sent back during normal business hours. But emailing us, and also if you're a third party with a tenant, we're going to probably need to see a release. And so all of that can be done by submitting to an email by going to our website at homelinemn.org and click on the link to email your question to an attorney. So they're
yes,
much quicker turnaround. I'm guessing maybe 2 days, whereas the other could be 4 to
yeah,
5.
yeah,
Depends on the week.
hmm, that's true. All right, perfect. Okay, so to the Q&A. Um, okay, so it looks like all the questions we have in the Q&A are from Charisse. And um, so Charisse, it sounds like you have a very specific question about your specific situation. So I do recommend giving us a call. We are free. Representation is not something that we offer, but so if you're looking for free representation, um, there are organizations like the Volunteer Lawyers Network or Legal Aid that might be able to assist, but I will say that one, they have income limitations, so it depends on your income. Two, most of them are focused on eviction actions right now, and they don't have the capacity to take on other types of cases at this point. So, but as Patty was saying, a conciliation court case or a small claims court case is something that hundreds of people do on their own every day. Not every day, every year, I'll say. Um, and so it
Yeah.
is something that is designed for folks who are not represented to be able to be successful in filing their claims.
Mhm. Let me also add to Sharice's question. A lot of times the dispute centers around factual matters, not legal questions, was this beyond ordinary wear and tear, things like that. And so an attorney, unless he or she has if they've observed this, they're not a witness here. And so the pictures and the tenant presenting their own documentation on my hypothetical when it's, a dispute about damages, it's not a legal question so much as, as a factual matter. So, and I always encourage my tenants, especially, and almost always they're articulate, they're intelligent, they're explaining their case to me. I said, you got this. That's how you do it. And I can't say for sure, but I think anecdotally, I'm not sure that many courts are really happy to see attorneys involved in cases right here where they don't nothing really to offer.
Yeah,
Right. So
I know.
that's my
Definitely heard from attorneys in Hennepin County, at least, who have brought like security deposit claims that the attorney often says like two words, mostly introducing themselves, and then the referee is asking the tenant the questions because, again, as Patty said, they're the ones who know what's going on. They know their situation, your circumstances better than anybody else. So, um, if you have questions about that process, we posted some resources in the chat. And again, feel free to call us and we'd happy to kind of walk through what the process looks like. Okay, again, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll be happy to take a look at them. Okay, Nicole is wondering, can you talk about any legal issues with performance and pre-lease deposits? What should tenants be aware of? I know pre-lease deposits are separate from security deposits, but are you okay with jumping into that? Because
yeah, I mean, I defined a deposit and it's not that, and that's what Nicole's talking about. It's by statute, and oh gosh, what number is that? Is it one? Rachel,
I'll grab it.
it's early. It's early.
175.
Okay, so 504B.175. I'm gonna do this off the top of my head, Nicole. But a tenant places money down, and it's called a pre-lease or a deposit to hold. That's the name of it. But by definition, a lease hasn't been signed. Okay, so that's the key thing. And it will state that, basically what the landlord's doing is, they're saying, all right, I've got all your information. I'm going to run a background check on you. But in the meantime, I'm going to stop marketing or maybe others away while I'm doing this. And so if I come back to you and say, yep, you're all approved, and you say, thanks, but no thanks, I'm moving on, the landlord, if they follow the statute, gets to keep your deposit. Now, but if you are approved, the deposit has to state that it's either going to go towards a security deposit or rent. But if a landlord, let's see, the landlord doesn't follow their own policy, including there's language have to, where there's a triggering event, return the amount prepaid by the tenant in 7 days. So whether they do the 7 days or not, they have to have that in the language. If they fail to do it, the remedy for the tenant is to sue for what's withheld plus 50%. That again can be done in conciliation court. This is a presentation about security deposits. It's a different animal. And as I said, I discussed it as a different for a definition. But that's statute. And it doesn't come up as much once they graduate. It doesn't come up as much with the ability to do background checks with a few clicks of the mouse. It was probably in past years where it took a while to get on the phone with old landlords and things like that. But we do see them from time to time.
Yeah. And I want to say, I want to encourage folks, if you do have questions that are above and beyond security deposits, please, we're happy to answer them to the best of our ability. Pre-lease deposits, as you say, Patty, are a little off the beaten path, as it were. but they come up from time to time. Absolutely. So
It's none of that 21-day language or anything like that. It's a totally different thing.
yeah, I popped the link to the specific statute language in the lease or lease in the chat. But yeah, basically yeah, Patty, you've got it off the top of your head, like well done. Check, check, check. So all right. Wolf is asking if it's not excessive, can a tenant hang pictures and then repair holes at the end of the lease?
Yeah, and I see a second question. So yeah, I made that joke about counting the number of holes. Here's the thing, what excessive and beyond ordinary wear and tear. These are all subjective phrases. And again, I'm going to assume for sake of argument that this lease doesn't have limits saying you can have X number of holes per square foot. I don't know what's excessive, but I also think that if a tenant, let's say they put a lot of nail holes up, or biggies is, maybe mounting a TV where you got bigger holes, things like that. I would check with the landlord prior to vacating. I never really recommend the tenant just go ahead and plug and paint, because invariably the landlord's going to come back saying you didn't do it right, you didn't do it enough, you didn't use the right coat of paint. So address it with the landlord. But what is excessive? I guess we really probably hear the extremes. Someone may put up a few holes. I think that's probably pretty normal. And some may put up, I can't remember the case offhand, but the one that made me think of that Beatles song, it was a lot of holes. They're counting in gotta have been 100. So a lot of the calls we have are somewhere in that extreme. And so the answer I have to give you is, for the most part, the calls we have are in between. It's not just a few holes, and the landlord should just consider that ordinary and tear, or so many that it's almost beyond counting. But I would address it with the landlord. Some tenants maybe they have the skills or know somebody who can patch and stuff like that. But I would, like I said, not embark on that, because it may make it worse. And the landlord might say it doesn't match. Now I'm going to repaint the whole room. I wouldn't have had to had you not done it this way. So that's the addressing the repairing of the holes, or anything like any repair. I would always caution a tenant from taking matters in their own hands. Just address with the landlord. It's not hiding anything. It's just saying, let's work together. You would charge me X, I can do it for Y and promise it'll be up to your standards, something like that.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, and Wolf also wants to know if there's a definition for repaired.
I don't think there is.
I don't think so. I think
yeah.
It would be, put it back to the condition that it was in, or that it was received, maybe.
And I didn't want to be smart alecky, but not broken anymore. Yeah, if there's follow again for anybody, specific questions, we can give that direct individual attention. So based on what I'm hearing, I think we answered the question as best we could, but for more specifics, you could just reach out to us.
Mm-hmm. All right. Anna is asking, what can landlords require when a tenant has a service dog or an ESA? Can they charge fees or require pet insurance?
Excellent question.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about fees. And I used the example of like smoking fees or pet fees. If the person has either a specially trained service animal or an emotional support animal, and requires some more document paperwork, things like that, then the landlord can't charge fees or require pet rent. Now, you listed pet insurance. You might have meant pet rent, or maybe all three. So basically, it's like the animal's prescribed as an aid for the tenant to kind of go about their life. Just like, for instance, a doctor may prescribe a walker for a tenant, or a wheelchair, or something to help their mobility. The landlord can't look and say, I'm going to bang up the walls, so I'm going to charge you, a fee. Same thing with the pet. Having an emotional support animal, I'm also going to call it a pet. I know they're not necessarily interchangeable, but the landlord can't say, I'm sure this animal is going to do more damage, so I'm going to charge you a fee. Or pet rent. Again, if they meet the qualifications. That's not to say, though, if there is damage done, whether by the pet or anything else, that the landlord can't seek to have the tenant be required to pay that. They can't a fee up front. I don't think they can charge an extra deposit, and they can't require pet insurance.
Yep. Yeah, they can't, yeah, you can't, it's like, as you said, having a walker, they can't charge you extra for it, but if your ESA does chew up the carpet, then that's arguably not normal wear and tear. So, um, Sharice again is asking what agency knows more about laws when it comes to persons on Section 8. We know plenty. Um, Probably the experts are your local legal aid group. So, you know, often we will refer folks out to them if they're on a subsidy, but we also we get plenty of we have plenty of info on Section 8 and subsidized other subsidies for housing.
Yeah, and
So,
I had a question, I'm not sure. Security deposit laws are the security deposit laws, but sometimes, I guess with Section 8, the rent is shared between the tenants, given their income and the subsidy voucher they have. I'm not sure if this question implies that what if Section 8 pays my deposit? Do
mhm.
I get it back? So that could be the question. So again, the discussion today is about security deposits. So I'm not sure if Sharice's question, who might have paid, if that's the case, or as was suggested before, she can certainly contact us directly.
Yeah, but I think that's also a good question about like just in general, if someone else pays the security deposit, who gets it back? And a lot of it is program dependent. Some programs are like, nope, we don't want that. That's your money. You go, we don't want that back. Some do want it back to, then pass on to the next person. So it's really program dependent. All right. So, um, but that's a great question, honestly, about, how do security deposits work when there are third parties involved? Okay, well, that is the end of our questions in the Q&A. We have about 15 minutes left according to my clock. So if folks have questions, whether it's about security deposits or other questions under tenant landlord law, we're happy to tackle those if they're general questions.
Yep.
Mhm.
We're all done with the chats and everything. I was letting you kind of monitor that, right?
That's it for what's in the Q&A. Again, if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A. All right, I'm looking at the chat. It looks like Nicole said thank you for taking a moment to talk about pre-lease deposits. Um, See, this is why I ask for the Q&A because I get lost in all of the chat bits. All right. Dan was asking about what documents are needed for show that someone is a victim of domestic violence. I put in the chat the link for the 504B.206. That's um, the statute that governs that particular way to break a lease. And the types of documents are kind of listed there. So I will put that in there again.
Mine, and then the tenant has to pay rent in the month they leave. So
Mhm.
you hold over it to the first day of the next month, you're on the hook for that month. So you have to have imminent threat of harm, the proper documentation, leave in that month. Deposit goes to the landlord and it's over unless there's other damages, but you owe no future
Mhm.
rent.
Yeah. All right. Shani is wondering how to deal with a management office with bad accounting. Oh, do I feel you?
I think you cut out bad accounting or response. I guess I must have an internet connection
How
with,
do they're wondering how do you deal with a management office with bad accounting, keeping bad accounts, bad ledgers?
I think you keep your own good accounts. I
Yeah.
mean, I mean, really just, and, if, here's a couple thing here, good question. Paying electronically, okay? You have, hopefully a record of what was paid. I like payments electronically. It's time and date stamped. If you pay with personal check, you would have a canceled check to prove when payments made. Problem with something like a personal check is when you deliver it to the landlord and when they deposit it, might be a lag, and then they might kick in late fees. Sometimes I'll tell a tenant, this is, if you are, let's say, paying your rent to a physical, let's say it's a lot, it's going to get there. No one else is going to get it, but it's on the weekend. It's on the 12th hour before the cutoff for late fees. take your cell phone out and timestamp video. Here's my rent payment. I'm putting it in the box. That's when it is. Even if the landlord doesn't open their office for till after the weekend, I paid on time. Keep those records. Another concern is if tenants pay by, let's say, cashier's check or money orders, and landlord's like, man, I get it. And then the tenants always say, well, Patty, I got a receipt. Well, the receipt they usually have is where they purchased it. That's just like saying I withdrew $1,000 from my bank. Yep, you withdrew the money. Well, where did it go? So tenants consider that's like cash. You want to get a receipt. If I'm handing somebody money in cash and I can't trace it, I want to get a receipt from them. I would consider money orders and cashier's checks to be the same thing. Now, if there's nobody in the office, as I described before, and you're placing in a lockbox, if you feel good about it being placed, but you want to document that it was placed, so that landlord doesn't come back with either got it late or he didn't get it at all, do that documentation. It's easy enough to do. But yeah, the answer to bad accounting is good accounting.
Yeah, basically and that goes beyond even just landlord tenant interactions. Anytime you're spending money anywhere, I would not necessarily rely on the other party to be the one to have the only documentation for what's happening.
Yeah. And one more thing, just kind of about this, and that is if your lease says rent is due on X date, most of the time that's a receipt date. Getting something postmarked on that date doesn't help you. It's got to be received.
Mhm.
And, we do get questions from time to time. Tenants, maybe their source of income doesn't arrive until 5th or 6th and rent's due on the 1st. And so, you got to kind of work it out or budget that. But just understand that if mailing is your only option, and we can insert joke or not about what the post office is or isn't up to these days, postmark isn't going to help you. Certified mail isn't going to help you. It has to be received. So you have to anticipate days ahead of time, or maybe consider doing some kind of electronic payment.
Yeah. An excellent point. Thank you. All right. Well, again, we're at about 10 minutes left, so there are no more questions that I see in the Q&A. Um, so Cherise, I see you. So here's a lot of what we see as well. Both landlords and tenants can say a lot of things, talk a good talk, but often there's no legal remedy until action is taken, right? And so going back to like if someone is trying to, say you owe me an extra $2,000 for this carpet that was destroyed, until they actually actively either send that to a collection agency or to get a money judgment against you, it's essentially two people just saying, you owe me this, no, I don't. You owe me this, no, I don't. There's no legal issue with it. It's until action is taken, that's where legal remedies then come in. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that so laws don't necessarily get that specific about what is bad accounting or is, preventing a landlord from saying that you owe something when you don't. It just prevents them from acting on that in a legal way.
And, whenever a landlord's threatening to file an eviction, I say this a lot. It's like, well, threatening to filing and winning are three different things.
Yep.
So they might be saying that to try to scare a tenant. Sometimes that works. But at the end of the day, landlords to file an eviction costs at least $300 just to start with filing. The serving depends on who and how they get it served, can range from 100, 150. So they're $450 in. So they may threaten all day long, but they have to throw down that money. And there's a risk that they won't get what they're seeking. That is to be ordered out of the unit.
Yeah, if they're filing on bad grounds, they're filing on bad grounds. So yeah, I think there's definitely, if there are specific examples about specific situations, give us a call. That's, I think, really what we're getting into with some of these. So
do you have any more to address? Because I had two more things to throw
why
out
don't
there.
you why don't you go ahead and address those things, and I'll see if anything else pops in.
Sure. So I think, Rachel, you were able to, I did what I alluded to early, that I would call it, I don't know if I call it a deeper dive, but a detailed analysis of the statute in a P. So that's available probably for attorneys and practitioners. Basically, I just kind of take the statute, I kind of highlight some language and put some notes in the margin. So it's a 2-page document that's provided. I want to draw attention to 2 things on it. I know you can't see it right now, but number one is the heart of the 504B.178, the security deposit statute, is returning the deposit. We talked about frame and receiving, delivery instructions. And that they can withhold for unpaid rent, et cetera, but also, damages exceeding ordinary wear and tear. I kind of think that you can also invoke another statute to give guidance to that, and that is statute number 504B.161. So let's pause for a second. Let's say a tenant just calls and X breaks, okay? And who's going to a lot of seminars and have and will and probably continue on repairs. But let's just say that I'm going to use a toilet, not to be indelicate. Let's just say the toilet overflows. Landlord gets a professional plumber out there. They do some tests and scans, and they go down there, and let's say something that clearly doesn't belong in the toilet, food, or let's say a toddler's toy.
I've seen toddler toys on several calls.
So now that's not part of the security deposit statute, but I'm discussion, the tenant's still there. And so on that hypothetical, I think the landlord would be within their right to pass that repair fee on to the tenant. So now when we're looking at, all right, everything's left, let's say there was that, the landlord paid a plumbing bill. They didn't think they have to. And then the tenant leaves and they didn't bill them, they didn't charge them, but now they want to take it out of the deposit. I think, again, the act of causing disrepair, on my hypothetical, the flush, what's going to cause the toilet to overflow initially, but it has to be that bad conduct, and that bad conduct is that willful, malicious, or irresponsible behavior that's listed in 504B.161 while the tenant's still a tenant. But I think that can be read together with the 504B.178 ordinary wear and tear accepted. Those things I think can be read together. And but the language allows for discretion. It doesn't specify. But again, it's not just the act of, in this case, flushing the toilet, as for the tenant would cause the overflow. But what was underlying it? Was it was it just bad plumbing, or did the tenant, intentionally or unintentionally put something down there that caused the problem? So I'm just picking on that as one example.
Right. All right.
And I had one more thing too. I know
Yeah.
we're really wrapping up. So also, and I can't remember, but I put in a link. Did we talk about carpet depreciation? And a lot of times the question is, the carpet in between, or let's say the tenants left. I think I did. I gave that
Yep.
IRS
Yes,
link
you did.
there.
I
Yeah.
will
But usually,
post it in the chat.
yeah, just to remind tenants that, if the landlord isn't even addressing depreciation, I think we have an issue there. Okay, I just want to remember that I did get that in.
Yep. All right. Fabulous. Well, I want to say thank you, Patty, for all of your information and wisdom on these things and your stories. I appreciate them very much. Thank you, everyone who joined us today. If again, this recording will be up on our website in a couple of days, along with the PDFs of the presentation. And we will be applying for 1.5 CLE credits at the end of this. So that will take, from our experience, a couple of weeks to get approved or not. That's not the fastest process, sorry. But we will send an email out to folks once we have that code for those who might be needing some CLE credits. So, and again, thank you very much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. We will be back next month with some more information. A CLE is for attorneys, it's continuing legal education credits. We got to get it in order to be able to continue practicing. So thanks all. Have a wonderful day now. Bye.